Alright, so we're starting a new chapter. My apologies, I think the version that's loaded on Blackboard actually has chapter 6 here instead of 4A. In a different textbook, this information is in chapter 6, so I apologize for the confusion there. Alright, so we've got 3 questions, alright, and then we'll swap off, okay? So make sure you've got your name on your piece of paper.
Excuse me.
Okay. Alright, what does the term hyperplasia stand for? So, I have a hint for you. Which type of growth? So we have 2 ways of growing. What does hyperplasia stand for? Which version? Do you need paper? Sorry. Anybody else need paper? Right, what does the term hyperplasia stand for? Which type of growth does hyperplasia represent? Okay, question number 2. Which letter does the shape of a growth curve roughly look like? So which letter of the alphabet does a growth curve roughly look like?
Can we just put the letter?
Yes. So question 1, what does the term hyperplasia stand for? Which type of growth? Question 2, what does a growth curve look like? What letter of the alphabet do we assign the shape of a growth curve? Okay. And question 3, what is osteoporosis? What is osteoporosis? So question 1, what does hyperplasia stand for? Which type of growth is hyperplasia? Question 2, what's the shape of a growth curve? We typically assign a letter of the alphabet that roughly represents the shape of a growth curve. So what letter is that? And question 3, what is osteoporosis? Alright, okay, trade-off. You're going to give 1 point for each question that's right, total it out of 3 points.
I didn't do it.
Okay, alright, hyperplasia is the increase in number of cells. So, increase in number. The other version is increase in size, hypertrophy. Right? So hyperplasia is increase in number of cells.
What if you just put like increased numbers?
Increased numbers is good. Right? If they just put numbers, half a point. Because numbers is a bit vague. Increase in number of cells. Okay? Number 2, which letter does a growth curve look like? S. Growth curves are called S-shaped. If it's a R, that's wrong. All right, so S or S-shaped is the answer you're looking for number 2. If they got that, give them a point. Number 3, what is osteoporosis? So osteoporosis is low bone mineral density. So you could maybe have thin bones or low bone mass. Yes, sir.
Would it be like the bones disintegrating after a period of time?
I would give bones disintegrating a half a point, because that would be the outcome of the problem, not the actual problem.
Okay.
So the weakening of bones because of loss of calcium.
Yes? That would be good.
Bone disorder?
Bone disorder's too vague. All right. So total those out 3 for me. Colton will come and pick those up, and we'll get going.
Put it on Alright, so you read. I need to say question.
Ooh.
Oh, the other one was science.
How is this not as simple in R?
See,
That was.
that's not a growth curve.
Maybe I was looking at the wrong one. What is this? What is this? What is this?
Yeah, that's not all.
As long as that is.
Oh, just
All right, so sometimes it's a little bit abstract to be in a motor learning or a motor development class and suddenly get dropped into prenatal development, all right? Because you might be sitting there going, well, this doesn't have anything to do with teaching movement or looking at how movement develops. But it's important to look at where we came from. There are a lot of things that go on prenatally that might impact what you see when you work with an individual. So everything that we see came from here, so we want to have a vague idea of what's going on that leads to a human that can move. All right? So it can influence what you've got to work with later on. And there's quite a lot of sensitivity to extrinsic factors for a baby growing in the womb. So we often think that's a very safe environment. The baby's really cozy and safe, but actually there's a lot that can go on there. So we're just going to take a brief look at what would be typical and then what could possibly happen. All right. So the rate of growth from conception through to infancy is the fastest growth you ever see a human do. All right, it's amazing how quickly that little clump of cells grows. So, growth can be influenced by both your genetics, your hereditary factors, okay, and extrinsic variables, so things going on outside the baby. That could be the environment in the womb, or it could be literally something coming in from the mother's bloodstream, or it could be something outside the mum that's applying pressure to the abdomen of the baby. And we have the same similar terminology showing up that we looked at already when we were looking at skills, right? We've got universality in growth and aging. If I'm a typical human being, then growth patterns hold relatively true across us as animals, right? But everybody does it slightly differently. There's a lot of individual variation that's very specific to me as an individual, right? And so it's important that we understand that because we want to make sure that what we're giving that person to do, whether it's athletic training, helping them with a rehab, or we're teaching an elderly person how to swim for the first time, right? Then how do we make those tasks developmentally appropriate, all right? We should be able, as teachers, to manipulate and think our way through how we present movement skills in a way that anybody with any given type of constraint could manage, right? You don't say, well, you've only got one leg, so you can't learn this skill, but you could learn. You should be able to find a way. How do I move things around to help someone? So early development, right, when we're looking at the first few days, the first few weeks, the first couple of months, most of that development, the majority of early development, is controlled by your genetic background, your genetic makeup, right? So normal development is organized by your genes, and you may have abnormal development occurring due to inherited problems if there's an error on the gene, all right? But also, we've got this sensitivity to what's going on outside. So it's predominantly genetically controlled, but there could be some outside things going on. Hopefully, those are all positive. So nutrition from the mum is an external factor, right? The baby doesn't provide its own nutrition. All comes from mum. That will be very positive. Or it could be negative. What if mum catches a virus that is bloodborne, right? That could possibly get across to the baby. Right? So these external factors, these extrinsic factors, interact with the genes, and we see development. So, first step, right? From conception to week 8, baby is called an embryo, right? And during that point in time, cells are differentiating really, really quickly, all right? Remember that at conception, somewhere in your background in school, they will have talked to you about the fact that we're looking at basically one cell, right? 46 chromosomes, 23 from each parent, one cell. By 3 days, we've got 32 cells. By 4 days, we have 90 cells, right? So these cells are splitting, differentiating, dividing, and rapidly multiplying, okay, over the first few days. And the group of cells is going to move down to the womb and attach. Placenta is not in place until week 2 to 3. So initially, this clump of cells feeds off its own kind of yolk that's within the amniotic sac. Right? Limbs are starting to form at about 4 weeks. So we get these little limb buds. They're not really limbs, they're just little blobs on the side of the bigger blob. Okay? Heartbeat can be picked up around week 4. Start to see a heartbeat. so the clump of cells that is becoming the heart start to do something, all right? And by about 8 weeks, there's something that's noticeably starting to look human-ish, right? Depending on your definition of what looks human. So, this is 5.5 weeks. So at 5 weeks, I brought props today, guys. I had so much fun going around the kitchen with my ruler yesterday, all right? So at 5 weeks, this is 5.5 weeks, but at 5 weeks, this baby is the size of a raisin, right? Just a few millimeters in size, 5 weeks. So many women, when we're looking at some of the things that can happen, obviously if that's growing inside you and it wasn't deliberate, there's a very good chance you don't know, right? Because it's a raisin, okay? So very, very small at this point in time, okay? But growing quickly. So 5.5 weeks, here we've got cells differentiating to become brain, all right? Here's an eye. Here's these little limb buds, so looks a bit like a paddle, right? And we've got some for the legs as well, right? Not human, but starting to look like a human. Right? Doesn't really look like much, and you wouldn't be able to see it very well without a big imaging or microscope. Okay? Six weeks. So here's our amniotic sac. Here's what's left of the yolk. It's not used, it's not feeding from the yolk. The yolk isn't providing any kind of nutrition at this point, because all the nutrition is coming via the placenta from the mum by week 2-3. Right? In this one, the baby is facing away from the image, right? So it's curled forwards, but it gives you a nice view of what is becoming the spinal cord. Right, and then you can see the arm buds popping out on the sides. And again, lots of work, lots of growth going on up here in the skull, or what will be the skull for the brain. So 6 weeks, still pretty tiny. By 8 weeks, it's looking quite a bit different. So at 5 weeks, we have the raisin, right? But 8 weeks, so just a mere 3 weeks later, goes from raisin to sun-dried tomato.
To what?
Sun-dried tomato,
Oh.
right? So that's a pretty dramatic change in size in just 3 weeks. Imagine if right now you changed that much in size in 3 weeks. You wouldn't even be able to get in the building anymore, right? So that's a huge amount of growth going on in those 3 weeks. Right? Really big change. And when we look at images of what is now transitioning to be a fetus, because at week 8 it transitions from embryo to a fetus. When we look at this, yes sir?
What do the bone structures look like right now?
Yeah, so not a lot, right? So these little black blobs, these dark areas that you can see,
Yeah.
is the start of bone development. So right now, this is like a jelly bean, right? There's no skeletal frame keeping it stiff. So these little black or darker areas are called primary ossification centers, and that's where cells that are going to become bone are being laid down. Right? Initially, they're laid down as something that's more like cartilage, and then we add calcium and magnesium and other things to it, and it solidifies and becomes bone. So we don't have any ossification yet, and you can see the same down in the long bones of the foot and the toes. All right, so we've got the shape of the toe by 8 weeks, but there's no bone in there. So it's just soft, jelly. Okay. So from 8 weeks until birth, then we're looking at a fetus. Okay. If you have a look at page 54 in your book, table 4.1, they give you some highlights of things that are happening at a particular number of weeks. So it's quite an interesting table to look at. Let's say week 4, heartbeat. Okay. And obviously from that sun-dried tomato at 8 weeks, by 9 months, I have to have something that's 7 to 8 pounds. So a lot goes on during fetal development, right? Growth by hyperplasia, increasing the number of cells, and by hypertrophy, so the cells that are laid down then get bigger. Right? And we see the developmental laws of direction come into play. So the first law is that growth is cephalocaudal. Right? We grow from top down. So if we go back and look, even here while it was still an embryo, there's a lot more going on at the top than there is down at the bottom. So cephalocaudal, head to toe, top to bottom. Anything where you see ceph is head. So if I have encephalitis, that's inflammation on the brain. And at the same time, the second directional law is proximodistal, near to far. That means that we grow, we develop from the midline out. So I've got more development going on, not no development, but more, and a little bit faster development going on around the head than at the toes. And I've got more development going on in the middle, in the trunk, than I do out at the fingers. Right? That's good because this is where all the organs are. So we want to get all the organs in place, get them growing before we bother wasting energy on fingers. Some tissue cells, though, have a degree of plasticity. Plasticity means that, if necessary, they could do something other than what they are genetically planned to do.
Isn't that like stem cells?
Yeah. Similar idea. All right, so the central nervous system, for example, even as adults, the central nervous system has quite a high degree of plasticity. If there's some kind of injury to your brain or to part of the spinal cord, then other cells within the system can take over the role of that area of the brain sometimes, depending on what the damage is. Right? So most of our cells, though, are differentiating and becoming specialized. So they're moving to be a toenail cell, right? Because a toenail cell is not the same as a lung cell. So they have to become specialized very early on. By 11 weeks, here we go. Here's the head, eye. Now look at our arms are starting, legs are starting. Here's the placenta providing nutrition. This dark area, I'm not a radiographer, I don't read these things, but I'm thinking that's either the stomach or the liver, right, at this point. Okay. So typically, then that baby's going to keep developing and become a healthy newborn, hopefully, healthy infant, all right? But sometimes, not very often, things don't go according to a typical trajectory. So what happens when there's an abnormal developmental pattern? So that could be due to genetics, it could be extrinsic. Right? So congenital abnormality, something to do, right, a congenital abnormality means the baby's born with that defect. It could be that there's a dominant defective gene, so one or other parent had a problem that was genetic. It could be a recessive situation, which is a little trickier because the parent that has the recessive gene would indicate symptoms for that recessive gene. But if you get two people with the same recessive disorder comes together, now that disorder is going to exhibit symptoms in the baby. It could be nourishment via the mother. So fetal nourishment is the single most influential external factor, period. If mum is healthy, if mum has a good source of food available that is nutritious, so if she can afford prenatal care, that puts her as an individual at a much lower risk of developing any kind of infections. And those factors then mean the baby is much more likely to be a typical developing baby, right? But if I'm a low socioeconomic status, if I live in a low socioeconomic environment, so could be in America on the wrong side of the tracks, right? In Alabama, in Auburn, where I was, the railroad tracks were the absolute divider in town. If you had money, you lived on that side of the tracks. If you didn't have money, you lived on this side of the tracks. The supermarkets, and there were 3, are all on that side of the track. So unless I have a car, that's a long walk to get food. So, yeah. So, right, a low socioeconomic environment might mean that mum doesn't have access to very good food. Or if we're not in America and we're in another country, maybe she doesn't have access to water. Perhaps the water hole is 15 miles away from where the village is placed. So, poor maternal health status means that now mum is competing for resources with the baby. So where does her body send those nutritional resources? Typically, it's going to send them to the mum, which means baby is likely to be low birth weight if it survives. So the placenta's job, and it does a pretty good job, is to screen out certain substances and to carry nutrition and oxygen to the baby and to carry carbon dioxide and waste products away from the baby. Okay. So certain large viruses get screened out, but some viruses that are dangerous or harmful for the baby are much smaller, and they're too small for the screening to work. Same with drugs. Certain drugs or certain chemicals the molecule is too large and it will get stopped at the placenta. Not the case with all of them. So genetic abnormalities obviously aren't affected by the placenta. The placenta is something that's coming across from mum. Harmful environmental factors. It could be pressure, could be temperature. So women who are pregnant are advised not to go in saunas or in hot whirlpools and things because that extra temperature is not safe. If mum's internal core temperature rises, then that's not safe for the baby's development. X-rays are not considered safe during this point in time. So the tissues are undergoing, the change in the size is so rapid, right? Everything is changing so quickly, then they're very vulnerable. So whichever particular tissue is dividing and expanding and developing at a particular time is going to be the one that's most at risk. Okay, so this graph figure gives you a kind of idea as to what's at most risk at any one time. Okay. So weeks 1 and 2, there's very little risk because mum's not attached to the baby yet, right? There's no nutrition, there's no oxygen from mum. So here, right, there's a high risk of spontaneous abortion here because it's just a clump of cells right now. Okay? It's still getting to the point where it could attach, and it's not getting any external nutrition yet. So often, this does not survive into week 3 or 4. Then around week 2, 3, we see the connection of the placenta, and then we start to see nutrition and different substances coming from mum to the baby. Right? So depends what's developing at the time. So for example, if you guys probably don't know, I haven't seen any for a long time, but when I was in school, when I was young, there were a couple of children in our village who were thalidomide babies. Thalidomide was a drug given to women in the late 50s and early 60s to calm them down because they were being a bit hysterical, right? And what they didn't know was that depending upon the point in the pregnancy that they gave mum the drug affected development of the humerus in the arm. And so the humerus didn't develop, and these babies are born with very, very short arms. So their hands are right near their shoulders. Obviously that changes a lot for their quality of life and their movement patterns because I can't, it's very difficult to reach into the cupboard and get out a can of baked beans if my arms are this. Okay, I have to have additional equipment in the house, so we've got to change the environment to allow for a particular outcome of a movement. Right? And here, the dark area is the point in the time of development when that particular item is at most risk. The lighter color strip is the risk is lower now, and once the strip is finished, that organ or that thing is done developing. So if I have the drug here, my upper limb is already formed. So mums who took thalidomide in week 16 didn't give birth to babies with short arms. If mum took earlier on, then there was an impact on the baby. Right? So the effect of the drug depends upon when it was given. Doesn't have to be a drug, right? Could be a virus, could be a chemical from something else. Right? When was it given? What was developing at the time? And how much of it was given? What was the dose? If it was a very small dose, maybe it doesn't have any effect at all. Perhaps the dose had to be quite high. Right? A lot of the things we see impact the size of the baby when it's born. Right? And that makes a big difference to us as movement people, because children who are small for their age at birth, so small for their age means that whenever they were born, they're smaller than they should have been. So if they're born at 7 months, they're not the size they should be at 7 months. Right? Low birth weight means that they might be the right size, lengthwise, but they don't weigh the right amount. Those are problematical because if the baby doesn't weigh what it should weigh, something didn't develop that should have developed. Right? If that was in the brain, then that could lead to learning difficulties. Right? But whatever, when that baby's born, it has some catch-up to do, right? It's going to impact what we see in growth and development for the infant and maybe the toddler, even the preschooler. I mentioned this morning we got 2 very tiny twins, teeny tiny, teeny. And this is their 3rd semester then, so you should have seen them this time last year. Itty bitty. Right? It's quite interesting to watch. Cognitively, they're pretty sharp. Motorically, they struggle quite a lot. So, on the Blackboard site, there's an additional PowerPoint on teratogens. So if you're particularly interested in which substances can cause what particular problems, there's some information in that additional PowerPoint there for you. What are some substances that pregnant women are told to avoid? Alcohol, big one. Drugs, cigarettes, right? Because they all have some impact on the baby. Cigarettes introduce carbon monoxide into the bloodstream. Carbon monoxide jumps onto the hemoglobin and blocks the hemoglobin's ability to pick up oxygen. And so then the baby's environment is hypoxic, it's low in oxygen. Okay? So the baby doesn't get enough oxygen to its cells to develop properly. So women who smoke put the baby at risk of that problem. Alcohol use during pregnancy can lead to what we call fetal alcohol syndrome. Right? Fetal alcohol syndrome has several different symptoms when the baby's born. They often have smaller brains than normal, and that leads to some mental retardation. They have some facial deformities often, so the skin fold under their eyes tends to be a little larger, and their faces are a little bit flat, and they just don't look quite right. Their eyes don't look quite right. They exhibit slowed growth once they're born, so they don't grow as quickly as we would expect them to during the first 6 to 12 months. Right? Sometimes they exhibit short attention spans. Sometimes they're hyperactive. So lots of problems. If the child has a short attention span and they're hyperactive, then they're often labeled as difficult by the classroom teacher. Because when we teach like this, which we know is not really the best way to teach, but if I want you to sit down and listen, and you're doing this, or you're looking out the window at the plane, or, right, then you get a label. You're a problem child in the classroom. You're difficult. And your learning curve is decreased because you're not paying attention and you're not listening. So they tend to be behind on their class development and their cognitive development as well. Okay. What about environments or situations that pregnant women are encouraged to avoid? So we mentioned x-rays. Okay, so you've got to be careful when you go to the dentist or to the doctors. Make sure they know, right? Because you shouldn't be getting x-rays at that point, right?
You said hot tubs.
Hot tubs, yes,
Increased
absolutely.
temperature.
Increased temperature. Long distance flights.
Pressure.
Pressure falling is a problem, right? So keeping our legs strong is really important. You don't want to stop exercising when you're pregnant because then you lose muscle mass and your legs get weaker. And where does my center of gravity go when I'm pregnant? Out. Past my base of support, which means it's very easy to tip over. Okay? It's why when you watch someone who's heavily pregnant, they walk like this. Right? Because that's the only way they can shift their center of gravity back over their base of support and not fall over all the time. It's going to be agony. It's going to be agony, right? So long distance flights is an interesting one because they drop the oxygen saturation levels down. In the air they pump into long distance flights, so when I fly home, there's less oxygen in the cabin than there is when you're outside the cabin. Because they want you all a little bit la 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 la, because you're easier to manage on the plane if you're not fully oxygenated. Isn't that right?
Yep.
And then if we're really lucky, they give us wine and then we're easy to deal with, right? So long distance flights are often discouraged for women who are pregnant. What are we told we should take? So should take folic acid, vitamins, pregnancy vitamins. You've got to keep up a calcium, a really good source of calcium and protein, because things are growing and building. We need the building blocks in order to grow and build. All right? So, on Friday, we'll start looking at postnatal development, growth and development once the baby's born. Just to lead into that, our overall growth pattern follows an S-shaped.
We'll go chapter 4, ain't we, Mitch?
Hmm?
Go chapter 4.
Still chapter 4. Wait. It's not 10 to sit down. Overall growth pattern follows S-shape. Right? That's what's typical. We want to know what's typical. So Friday we're going to look at what is typical. If I understand what's typical, I can recognize what is atypical. Right? What is unusual? I have to know what's normal to know what isn't normal, and if I can recognize something that's not normal, I can adjust how I'm trying to teach that. Okay. Remember that we said individual specificity is really important. So yes, we've got this overall pattern, but we have huge variation in the timing. So I get a growth spurt when I'm born, and then we hit puberty, but we don't all hit puberty at exactly the same point. All right, so what is the specificity? The more I understand what to expect, the more effective I can be at teaching it, the more effective I can be at helping an individual set realistic goals. Because there's no point in them saying, I want to play basketball in the Olympics if they've already finished their growth spurt and they're 5'1". Probably not going to get picked for the US basketball team.
I hope.
So, I'm sorry. Right? What else can they be really, really, really good at?
Lifting.
Lifting, there you go. Low center of gravity. Okay. Timing differs between the sexes. So, what's the difference between the girls in the class and the boys in the class? Right? What do we expect to see on the timing? And then we'll come back and look at this again, but look at, before Friday, look at the diagram on page 66. Right? They have a really interesting diagram here because it's looking at proportional changes in the body. They put everybody on the same size scale, but you look at proportion. And then think about the information from chapter 3. If all my weight is up high, right, so when I'm born, my head is about 1/4 of my length. Right? And it weighs a lot, that. Right? It explains a lot about what we see happen with movement patterns with young children. When I'm an adult, my head now is only about 1/8 of my entire length. Right? So we don't have any trouble balancing and doing skills that involve balance as adults. I'm not top heavy as an adult. So make sure that you have a look at that and get a feel for where's the center of gravity moving as we change proportionally. As we get older, the variability gets bigger. Right? There's more variability amongst us as adults than there was amongst us as children, because extrinsic factors play a much bigger role as adults when we theoretically stopped growing. So we'll come back to that idea on Friday.